Lastly here then, I want to leave you with a video talking somewhat about workflow. We've seen a lot of detail thus far on different practices and approaches to animation. We've seen, of course, the specific tools and the ways that we can go about implementing certain principles in those tools. And of course, it's the adding together of all of these techniques that define our workflow. With all of that, though, it's not at all unfair to ask the question, what's going to be the best? What's going to be the most helpful? Take, for instance, what we saw about keying offsets and overlapping motions. Should we more often go for having time-shifted keys? Should we go for the old Lango method where you've got inline keys and your offset and overlap is actually built into the poses of the keys? Or should you go for inline keys and swing the bias of your curves to create your little time offset? When we're animating, should we more often start with the pose-to-pose method, or is straight ahead preferable? Or indeed, are there different answers to all of this depending on the specific motion or transition that we're working on at any given point in time? The answer is that there is no fixed answer. I once heard it said that there are as many approaches to and workflows for animation as there are animators. And in my own personal opinion, I think there's a good chance that that might be somewhere near the truth. Now clearly, if you're newer to animation, then that doesn't really give you much of a starting block to launch from, as essentially it's just saying, well, here's all of the different techniques, you're just going to have to play around with them all and figure out the workflow that is best for you. And certainly in the long run that is true. As you get more and more practiced at animation, you will find certain techniques and workflows that you just like better, that you find more easy to understand or wrap your head around in terms of key management and pose management and everything else. And this will come just from practice and of course from trying out the different techniques at different times. But one of the things about being newer to animation is that you kind of do want to get stuck in a bit and actually start animating stuff. And so to that end, it can be helpful to have something of a playbook which to follow. So let me show you here what my own workflow is. Obviously, in the projects examples that follow, where I'm going through with you animating a whole bunch of stuff, I'm going to be doing it in the approach and the workflow that I am most used to. The method I use, the approach I use, is fairly well ordered. The idea behind it is to really try and nail down all of the specifics of the motion as best you can at one phase before moving on to another phase. And generally as I work, I try to sort of build an animation. I tend to grow it somewhat organically, so it starts off simpler and becomes more and more detailed and complex over time. I find this helps me to make corrections in timing and spacing and pose and everything else as I go along. And it also helps me to get a good sense of the overall shot or scene at all points during my animation. So, what is it then? Here it is. When starting an animation fresh from scratch, sometimes I go pose to pose, sometimes I go straight ahead. Generally, this depends upon the motion that I'm actually keying. If I'm doing something that is generally stable, steady, has something of a constant flow to it, such as a walk cycle or run cycle or similar, then I tend to go straight ahead, as what I'm really looking for is, the speed at which the character is moving through the scene. I'm just trying to get very quickly to the overall rate of motion. In anything else, when I've got perhaps more detailed motions, a character's performing some straight action or he's stopping and starting and there's lots of changes in what they're doing, or perhaps if I'm doing some kind of performance piece, then I tend to go pose to pose to begin with, as this helps me to really sketch out the motion as a whole, see which poses and actions are working, fiddle all that around, and get a good overall view of this more complicated motion from beginning to end right at the start. As such, I'll generally wind up with something like this when I've finished my pose-to-pose phase. It's got usually some of the in-betweens at the midpoint of transitions within them. as a way to help sketch out lines and beginning to get what will eventually become arcs of motion into a character movement. As for instance, we can see here on the hip controller, or the root controller I should say, where of course we have it as up, then down and along. So this down and along part will of course later become a nice arc of motion. This is generally the level that I will get to in a pose-to-pose stepped key scenario. I'll get all of the major pose detail in there, and I will begin working in the more important and major transitional details, just to begin sketching out the arcs. And by the time I'm finished with the pose-to-pose section of my animation, the overall motion itself, the general sense of timing and pacing, should usually be pretty clear. And as such, I'm able to judge, yes, this is working, no, that isn't working, what have you, and of course, go round and make any necessary changes. If I'm not working pose to pose and I'm working straight ahead, then I always do it to begin with in linear keyframes. Also, in the case of pose to pose, almost always when I come out of my pose to pose stepped key phase, the next phase I go to is linear keys. So no matter which way I've started, I always wind up in this linear keyed phase. What I do with my linear keyed phase is I really start to then begin working in more of the detail. I will absolutely work on breakdowns and transitions, and I will begin sketching out arcs of things. When it comes to doing overlapping motion, follow through and secondary animation and the like, I personally am not a big fan of trying to do it with curves where I swing curve bias. I find that I have to get too far along in the animation process before I'm able to really start seeing those details. And then, of course, if I need to adjust things, I find it more work to, of course, have to go back and make the necessary corrections. As such, I use a mix of either time offset keys or the Lango straight line method with the offset and overlap built into actual keyed poses. And I always do this during the linear phase. What I often find as a result is that by the time I have completed the linear phase of my animation, it is already starting to look very near finished. You've got a lot of the detail, you've got a lot of the subtlety and the nuance of the motion has been worked in on actual keyframes. I also find doing this because, again, I very much like control in animation. I want to be sure that my characters are hitting exactly the right notes and moving through exactly the right transitions the way I need them to. By getting to the point where it's all linear and the motion is looking near complete, I know that everything that is happening, every frame that I'm seeing, is the result of the fact that I've specifically made it that way. It's not some accident that I'm getting a result of a curve interpolation or something like that. Also, the other benefit to this is I know that if I can take an animation and key it in purely linear keyframes, and it can look slick and it can look soft and alive, and the character really, flops and weaves about in a very organic and natural way, then it is an undeniable fact that when I go further and start putting things into spline, that it's going to look even better still. And consequently then, once I finish the linear phase, that is exactly what I do. I take my keyframes, I dump them all over to splines. Mostly I go into TCB, obviously having created a lot of the detail of the animation during the linear phase. I don't really need to go to Bezier's an awful amount of the time and start fiddling with handles to, manage my tweens that way. A lot of the time all I really need to do is just take my linear curves that I've got and just make them smooth in between keyframes, and TCB does that very well. As such, this is then the last stage of my animation, smoothing out what I've done so far, getting that real final slickness and final polish into the motion that really brings it to life. I will also, of course, work in extra little details to tighten up the in-betweens that are occurring between the keys I do have. So, of course, I'll swing TCB values, or if there's something really specific that I want to do on a particular transition here or there, I'll, pull up a Bezier or something and just make that one little correction. So there we go. If you're not sure, of course, how to approach animation coming from fresh, you've got all these different techniques and ways of working with keyframes and curves and everything else, and you're looking for a workflow to use to just get started, get practicing, then I would recommend you try this one out for starters. It's nice and simple because it is a phased system of producing animation. It's an ordered and structured workflow, and thus it's able to help you bring order and structure to your animation, making sure that you've got all of the details and other parts right. Of course, as I already said, it is the workflow that we will see used when we get into the project section. So hopefully, as you work through and watch those videos, the particulars of this workflow will become more clear, and you'll see at each stage along the way the results of it.